So welcome to Transform Gov, where we explore digital transformation in the public sector. And I'm your host, Maeve Neefsey. So this week, we're diving into the incredible world of mainstream AI, and for example, like ChatGPT and how it's shaping the public service. And our guest today is Vinny Wade, who's Professor of Computer Science at Trinity College Dublin and co-founder of the ADAPT SFI Research Centre. And he's a bit of a powerhouse really in the field. And he joins us on Transform Gov to discuss the real opportunities really and perhaps hidden risks, right, that are associated or opened up, let's say, by AI. So very, very welcome, Vinny.
Thank you very much indeed.
So AI has been around, right, since the 50s. And certainly when I first worked, my first job was working selling ads and computing, which is a computer magazine over in the UK. But AI was there then. And there was all this excitement about AI, but that never really came to fruition. So what's different now?
So there's two things that are different now. We had a revolution in AI from about 10 to 15 years ago, where we began to use neural networks. These were mathematical models which would allow us to predict based on data and could learn from data. This whole area of machine learning, and particularly neural machine learning. What that means is that it's able to extrapolate based on the data we have what might happen next. Where Gen AI is very different is it's not just analyzing data, but what it's doing is generating new content for us. So in the same way we might talk and ask questions, we can ask questions of Gen AI and it will generate the answers. These are answers which had never actually been generated before. They're not part of an existing document. It's actually language that has been actually generated for us based on our requirements. So it fits us much better. And it can be text, it can be images, it can be spoken word because it can generate voice, and it can be video, which means that it's of any particular type of data and any particular form that you want it.
And is there something happening in terms of technology that enabled it? Why now?
So two parts of that again. The first one is the speed of processors. So as we began to have the cloud and as we began to have that amount of processing power in the web or in the network, it gave us the space to actually do that sort of analysis, storing the massive amount of data that these particular technologies require, but then also the processing power. And that's a challenge because as we've moved in Gen AI and as we've realized that this doesn't really work in a small scale. This works only when you have lots and lots of data, massive data. So what that means is we need massive storage facilities as well as processing facilities. That's where those cloud engineers, that's where those cloud computing came in. And that really was only available in the last 5 to 6 years. And as the processing power has become more and more powerful, and as the storage has become more and more available, and the harvesting of that data, then we're in a situation where we can really use that. So it's really only in the last 3 or 4 years that this has happened.
So you've been involved more than 3 or 4 years.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
Did you read the future? Did you see it coming down the track? How did that all happen for you?
We've known about the particular technology behind all this is called a language model, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But we've known about language models for 20 years. They're not new. What is new is as you begin to have much larger language models, you end up with this phenomenon where the predictions that it's making for the next appropriate word and the next appropriate sentence is becoming much more accurate. And what's happening is the eloquence and the power of the language model only becomes visible as you get larger. And that's where you see the race at the moment between, say, Google and Amazon and OpenAI.
Yeah. Are they any different, actually? That is a question, isn't it? Are they all doing the same thing? Are they better at different things?
So I would say that they are part of the same genre and they're part of the same idea. But what they have been doing is separating a little bit in terms of where they're applying it. So, for example, in Facebook, what we see a lot of the Gen AI technology around generating chit-chat, having short conversations and so forth, where you see it with Google and we see it at OpenAI, they're really focusing on question answer. They call it dialogue, but it's not. You don't really have that long a dialogue with this. You ask it questions, you may refine those questions, you may get it to simulate certain situations, but you really aren't having a one-to-one dialogue. Other vendors, they're really trying to build these digital assistants which have these constant conversations with you. So we're beginning to see them being trained slightly differently with different content or with different facility. The other part is that as we call these foundation models, these ones which are very, very large and general purpose, we're beginning to see now are built on top of them very focused, very specific purpose, maybe trained for a particular area of customer care.
Specialization, perhaps?
Exactly. So, for example, we might see them in customer care. When you're talking to that bot that seems to be a person, it's probably not a person, it's probably Gen AI behind it, pretending to be a particular person or representing a particular type of interaction. It could be an assistant which is talking you through a particular task, maybe filling in forms or whatever, and it's constantly giving you advice of what to do next or what the questions mean or anything like that. Again, very, very specific. So we're seeing those as well because when we get into specific applications, it becomes very specific in terms of context, and context becomes really important. If I take an example, in education, it's not just about giving an answer, it's about actually trying to provide an educational experience. So we're seeing the beginnings of online tutors, where the tutor is the chatbot, but the tutor understands a little bit about pedagogy, understands a little bit about, okay, I need to ask you questions to get you to think, get you to respond. Now I'll try and move you through, recognize when you've got something wrong, and then suggest, well, is this another possibility? So it's no longer just giving you the answer. It's actually stepping you through the process. Think about that in terms of in government. So let's say you take an example of where a citizen has a query about a driving license or something. It steps them through the process. It answers their questions. They might have questions which you wouldn't expect, but Gen AI could cope with that because it was trained specifically on that area.
So I remember when we were first doing some systems, we were trying to set up a questions and answers, FAQs, all that kind of stuff. Yeah. You would do scenario building. Yeah. So this is completely skipping all of that, and the solution itself builds the scenarios. I mean, as long as you give it access to the content, to the answer, is it kind of intelligent in terms of what it's learning and how it's using the information? Okay, well, let's first of all,
the way you'd use it, if you were using it as an application, then it would already have that scenario in mind. So it would have trained on relevant content and seen relevant conversations in that space. So then it is able to apparently understand what you're saying. I'll talk again a little bit about the apparentness versus the reality, but predict an appropriate response. And it'll step you through that particular conversation. Now, in order for that all to happen, the AI needs to be trained. Okay, so in Gen AI, we think of two kinds of training. The first is where we have it pre-trained. It's already trained. It's massive. We call them foundation models. These are the ones like ChatGPT. These are the ones, or GPT-4. These are the ones like Gemini and Google. These have been trained. They've cost up to 100 million to train on massive amount of data. What they've actually done is have created a large, eloquent base of information. They may not have the specific responses that you want for your particular domain, but it has a lot of general information. What you then might do is say, okay, well, I can, by asking it the right questions or giving it the right scenario, I can get it to focus in on the particular answers I'm interested in this chatbot producing. And that's where they call it prompt engineering, where the system is actually, if you like, listening to the user, amending the question that's actually being asked, and giving a response that's appropriate. Okay. It also, in particular over the last 2 years, we've now built where it actually has context. So you can give it extra information about the particular topic you want with the query. So again, it could be the system, not you as an end user, but the system is getting that extra information and is using that at runtime to formulate an appropriate reply and give it back. We call that context.
I suppose I'm probably like a lot of people who are using, ChatGPT or whatever, OpenAI, in the sense that I use it for my own work, whatever I'm doing. And sometimes I would test it with to answer questions of things that I knew the answer to that weren't necessarily very well known.
Right.
And it was getting it wrong quite a lot.
Right.
Now it seems to have really improved.
Yes.
So what's that improvement due to? How's that happening? So ChatGPT 4, is it 4.0?
4.0, yeah. 4.0 is a significant improvement on the 3.5. A couple of things. First is the size of the model. So let me just explain what that means. These things have been trained on huge amounts of data, loads of documents, usually documents across the world, across web scraped, across the web, as well as publicly available information, okay? So it's trained on these very, very large models. What's happened is, as the models become larger, they become more exposed to a much greater amount of information that it's processed and trained on, so it's able to give even more accurate information. The second part is we've begun to get much better at training them, so we don't necessarily let them hallucinate as much as they used to. So,
talk to me about hallucinations. I mean, that's a whole word that only came into my consciousness recently. So they talk about hallucinations and AI. What is that?
So to understand simply what a language model is, a language model is, it takes the vocabulary that we use and creates an encoding of that. And then it reads loads and loads of sentences based on that encoding of how people have put these sentences together. That's what it's trained on. So it doesn't actually understand the words. What it has is understands the probabilities of the combinations in any sentence. Now, not just your next word, like the cat sat on the, mat. It knows the context and relationship between those words in that one sentence. So when it's actually suggesting the next word in a sentence, it's hard to believe that it's actually just generating word upon word upon word and yet coming up with such eloquent responses. When it's doing that, it needs to have a huge amount of information. So in order to do that, they have, we call it parameterized, but it's created this network with yet more connections and more connections. That sheer size is what's generating the eloquence. However, it's only words, okay? It doesn't actually experience anything. It doesn't put its hand in the fire and know, that is hot. There is no real experience. There is no rules in there. There are no facts in there. It's just language. So when we say hallucination, what it's putting together is, that's a credible word after that. That might be right. So I take a simple example. I was head of a CEO of the Adapt Centre, and I work in Trinity College as a professor. In the early days of 3.5, I used to do for my students, I used to say, get it to say, who is Vinny Wade? And it would come up with this eloquent CV. And it was quite good until toward the end, where it's confabulated or hallucinates the fact that the alternative for hallucination is confabulation. But what it got confused about is CEO Adapt TCD, and it just dropped the Adapt. So it became the CEO of TCD, which would have been a lovely, very nice. And the Professor Doyle, Linda Doyle, was doing a great job. I didn't want to take her job, but it was just to show an example of that's purely language.
Yeah.
There was two bits of words that were kind of similar, and it didn't see a difference, and it just puts them together.
Something important,
and that's why the original inventor of neural networks. Prefers to use the word confabulation because it's putting a couple of words together that really shouldn't be.
Yeah.
It's a language thing. But actually hallucination has become the more documented, more accepted term for it. It's hallucinating because it's putting together what could be credible or possibilities, but they never really existed.
They don't.
And the reason why it's so, you have to be careful about it, is that these chatbots and these large language models, what they produce is so eloquent. So
it's so convincing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It becomes so convincing. So you have to fact check these things. You have to look at, and see what it's saying now. Hang on a second. Let's go back.
It's very good, for example, for case studies, right? So let's say let's say you're in a public sector body and you're looking at AI and you're thinking of using AI. Give me 5 examples of organizations, a local authority, and how they've used AI.
Yeah.
But then if you just take it at face value, sometimes it could be very wrong.
That's right.
So you have to say, well, actually, let's see if I Google it and actually look for deeper information.
Yes.
Is it correct? So you can't just take it at face value.
You can't, but you can also argue backwards and give me the references for that.
Yes, I do that. I love that. It's very good on the references.
Exactly. So, and then you've got to check, because sometimes in the early days, it actually made up references that just for completely non-existent documents.
That's a very human thing to do.
Yeah, well, it's a confabulation. It's pretty credible. This document should be here. I'll tell you a funny story. A friend of mine, he he was booking holidays for his kids, and he was saying, like, they're teenagers. I want to make sure that they can go out and enjoy themselves and be active. So he looked up various adventure parks, and using ChatGPT, he decided, let it suggest it, and it suggests this adventure park, which seemed to be exactly what he wanted. Turned out it never existed. It was a confabulation of two different parks, but it even given them a price for the ticket.
That's bizarre.
Yeah, But that was in the early days.
Yeah.
Now, you wouldn't get that now.
No. I don't want to frighten people either, right?
No, exactly.
So there must be, you've been involved in so many projects to adapt where you're actually applying AI.
Absolutely.
So tell us some of the interesting case studies that you think are examples that might be relevant maybe to people in the public sector.
Sure. One of the ones that I'm working on at the moment is where we're trying to help teach students about a particular programming language, SQL, database language. And normally you do it through lectures and so forth, but what we want to do is build an assistant which would actually answer questions about the language for students. So they can, at any stage, 24/7, can ask the chatbot specific questions about this language, how it would work, test it out, ask it, would this work, and so forth, so that they can actually, quickly assimilate. Because remember, one of the things with students is they're all at slightly different levels.
Mm-hmm.
Even though they might be in the same class, some of them might have done a summer student job that did it. Yeah. Others might be brand new to them. They're coming from a different stream or whatever. So you have students in a class coming from very different backgrounds.
I presume because it's anonymous, then nobody's hearing your stupid question. People ask more stupid questions.
So that's actually been researched, and it is quite true. One is the 24/7 being availability. The second one is that non-judgmental. Mm-hmm. And we see that both in education and also in healthcare.
Okay, so it doesn't go, that's a really stupid question, can't you believe you asked it?
Exactly.
I thought I taught you that in the first term.
But also you're not worried about what the ChatGPT or whatever it is thinks of you. Mm. So you don't mind asking it again. It's a computer. It's a program. Mm. It's not a person. So the result is that people are quite happy to ask that. Quite happy to find out information that, if they don't understand, they can say, well, explain that to me again. Okay. So in those situations, we find that actually there's a preference for using those chatbots. The other part is that you don't have to wait around. There's no annoyance. Chatbots don't get angry. So again, all of that side of things, that human nature part is not the same. So we're seeing that it's a very accessible technology. We find that once users first start using it, the friction is very, very little. In other words, it's very easy. If you can ask a question, you can use Gen AI. Mm-hmm. It's that way. However, what we are finding is that as users, if we can explain to them how best to query these things.
Okay, so the prompts really matter, do they? The questions?
They do.
Yeah.
They do. And I suppose we think of the general question is kind of for an end user, but if you were in a company, right? Let's take some simple examples of Gen AI in government, right? So one is you've got a query coming in and you want to find out information. So you use it for retrieval. So people are using Gen AI, whether it be Gemini or ChatGPT or whatever. They're using them to actually look up information.
To help somebody else.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But they can phrase the question specifically for their need. So the old problem was if you did put it into Google and so forth, you end up with a document and you're desperately trying to find what part of the document is really that appropriate, and it's constantly telling you things you know and you want the bit you don't know, right? So with this, you can be much more focused, and it will then give you that explanation around it. And then if you want to follow up, you can have that dialogue. So it's an interactive dialogue.
For example, if I said to you, is the train accessible?
Yeah.
All right? Yes, it is.
Yeah.
The 2 o'clock, the 5 o'clock, 7 o'clock. But if I said accessible to somebody with a wheelchair, who blah, 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 so I can really get specific.
Yes.
And then it can dig out from all the plethora of information, just the right answer.
Yeah, that is absolutely true, with one proviso. Some of the chatbots don't use as much real-time information as they should.
Okay.
So, for example, you would remember in 3.5, it would constantly tell you that the last time it was trained was in 2023 or whatever.
Yeah.
GPT-4 is improved and is more recent. When people deploy these, they actually want to be able to deploy it with some real-time information so that that train on that day is that way. So it has access to the current schedule.
And you've obviously been involved in a lot of projects. People are only starting now, because we do the awards, which, by the way, everybody's 19th September. Don't forget to get your ticket. But anyway, for the AI category, the entries weren't anywhere as big as perhaps something like cross-organization collaboration, right? Because it's early.
That's right.
So, are there examples of or guidelines or places that people can kind of see where other public sector have learned from deploying AI, and they can learn from that?
Yep.
Could you share any of that?
Sure. So the kind of applications people are using at the moment for are things like retrieving for information. They're using it for that problem where you've got a blank page and you've been asked to write a report on. Mm-hmm. It will help you generate some. You need to fact check. You need to rephrase yourself, but you still need to do that. It can summarize for you. So let's imagine you've got a huge amount of information. Tell me the top 5 key points in this or whatever.
Which I struggle with massively, so it's very helpful.
And also when people, when they're writing document, they want to say, okay, can you make this more readable for somebody who's maybe not as technical? Mm-hmm. And it will just remove the technical information, put in appropriate general purpose words. So in those situations, they're very much around for an individual that helps them do their job better.
Yeah.
And that's the way we're seeing in e-government, but in all of other industries. That's how a lot of time Gen AI is first being used. We call it personal productivity.
Okay.
And it's somewhere between 10 and 30% increase in productivity by doing these things. Okay,
that's a lot.
That is a lot. And where I'll talk a little bit about what you have to look out for. But in terms of the individuals who are using it, they are then showing other people in the organization are saying, well, actually, this is really useful. What's happening then is companies are saying, okay, we got to put some guidelines around this because we have to be careful of certain things. And we'll talk about the threats in a second. But in general, what's happening for e-government is a number of governments, like the UK government is a good example, and the US is doing it as well. They're putting out guidelines for public service staff saying, okay, this is what Gen AI is. These are the things, it will help you, absolutely. But these are the things you really need to be aware of. And that's where for this personal productivity, you need to be. So, for example, you should never be sharing personal information of anyone because you don't have the consent to share it with. And once you've shared it, you've broken, for in Ireland now, or Europe, GDPR. Mm-hmm. Okay. Second thing is, if it's confidential information, so let's imagine that you're working in a government and you're working on policy, developing policy. You can't just put that new policy in and say, tell me how this differs from these other policies.
Yes.
Because you're literally exposing something that's sensitive information. So there's a whole series of kind of behaviors that one would expect. Obviously, any citizen information shouldn't be shared. Second thing is what some governments are putting in place is what we consider to be special purpose or private Gen AI, where it's inside the firewall of the organization, in this case, government services, in which case then they will say, okay, in this situation, this is within, so this is okay to share this, but not this.
So you could have a centralized, collaborative, open AI space that all government departments or organizations could share, but nobody else. Yes. Or maybe not. Maybe you'd make it more narrow.
It really depends. What you'd have is that organized in such a way that certain news can only are filtered in certain ways. So you can build up that. That's how some governments are moving forward on this. They also want to make them very aware of things we talked about, so hallucination. Mm-hmm. We also want to be aware of the fact that sometimes, particularly if you're using open models, you don't know what they're trained on. So are there inbuilt biases? If you're dealing with subject areas,
must be a big issue.
Yes, it is a big issue.
We're biased without even knowing it. So
if it's based on public information, it's as biased as the public information. But it also, you got to think in terms of, but it also depends on how much of that, what was the weighting and so forth for the person who trained and what was selected and what was deselected. So in those situations, you do have to be aware of bias and you do have to be careful. And there's a growing care in terms of what we mean by trustworthy AI and what we mean by how it should be ethically used. So in those situations, again, that's where those values come in. That's where those behaviors defined in commercial organizations by the commercial organization, in e-government or government by the public service.
I think we firstly, we're going to have to do part 2. I mean, that's obvious. So we haven't even touched on legislation and guidelines and what's going on around that and some of the other cases. But in your not necessarily work that you're involved in, but what have you seen as probably the most exciting use of AI within the public sector? And it could be quite mundane, but do you think it could be revolutionary?
I think there's a couple of ones. I'm involved in a startup which is looking at elderly care and care in the home, and being able to address that social isolation of that person. We know that they survive better if they're able to still live in the home or still live in their apartment or whatever it is, but they need that constant contact. And we know that the care workers can't always get there, and it's not always. So having something which can actually have that daily dialogue, identify things, reconnect, keep people from being isolated.
So we're going beyond saying, Alexa, what time is it? Or Alexa, what's the ingredients
absolutely.
for a recipe?
We're saying, how are you doing today? How do you feel? By the way, I was looking at social media, and your daughter was in the post today about this, or I was checking that. So it's reconnecting the individual back into their social network, or letting them know what's going on. It's that sense of connectivity that becomes very important. So that's a really good example of flourishing and using technology to flourish.
Absolutely, because I know that my mother, for example, she's in a nursing home, which she loves, but her challenge is that as her eyesight and her dexterity goes, accessing on her iPad, she loves listening to music or whatever it is, or navigating through the TV becomes a real problem. So it's a blocker. So if she could have somebody to ask, by the way, can you find me a channel with, I don't know, classical music playing?
But also they can break it up, because if the system will actually, unlike Alexa, which becomes a bit funny in places where you kind of, Alexa misinterprets you and you get a
completely different answer.
Yes, exactly. Whereas it can have a dialogue saying, now, which ones did you want? Did you like this or this? And it begins up understanding that person, but also understanding the likes and dislikes, and then understands and will be able to interpret much more accurately what it is that particularly is for that particular person, what's appropriate. So we have this. My research is in the area of personalisation, where the system learns about the individual, and we add that to the mix in terms of selection of generation of content for that individual. So that becomes a phrase I use is, I think about content as being liquid, and it takes whatever shape is most appropriate for you to consume it, whether you like a big glass or a small glass or a sherry glass or a pint glass. But the point is, it suits you. It suits your need, and it satisfies you.
But could it be, and again, I'm only extrapolating, but let's say your politics aren't so great, or your attitude to the world is a little bit, unacceptable.
Right.
Could it just keep feeding you back what you like to hear?
Right. So this is the danger. And we've learned some of these mistakes, or we identified some of these mistakes in social media, which is effectively polarized society in many different ways. And with Gen AI, we don't have to go down that route. It does depend on the provider. It does depend on the technologies and the way it's tuned. But in general, no, you don't have to do that way. You don't necessarily want to make the person angry all the time. We know that in social media, let's say Twitter or other ones, I'll use Twitter rather than calling it X, that as long as I can arouse an emotion in you, I can get you to stay on. So they'll either try to make you really happy or really annoyed. Annoyed is usually. And so that's why you get that sort of stimulation. That may not actually work in a dialogue. People get tired arguing that way, particularly if things coming back. So what you can do in personalization is actually find information that suits it, but also then balances it. And that's where we're trying to see, okay, where are the ethics here? What are the ethical guidelines in terms of how it should be used and so forth? Now, there's legislation in the AI Act, and we can talk about that in part 2. Yeah. But in general, what we're trying to do is make it much more transparent. So, for example, if you're talking to these chatbots, it's a chatbot. That's the first thing. And people kind of go, of course you'd know it's a chatbot.
Well, you might not.
Because if the voice hints are pretty good, and the eloquence is very good, and now at this stage the prosody is pretty good as well. I mean, the rhythm of the
it doesn't sound like a robot. It sounds like anyone.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so you've got to make those kind of things explicit. There are certain guidelines in place, but we're still developing them. To be fair, this is a very young technology. And if you look at any of the guidelines, they'll always say this is a living document, because as the technology develops, we need to be able to adapt. And we need to be able to
There's so much more to talk about. We're going to wrap up this part 1, come back to part 2, and we've so much more to talk about. Don't miss it, because we'll be talking about what is the legislation that's coming down the track. I think, from my understanding, EU is very far ahead, which is always good news. But first of all, let's thank you very much for coming back for part 2.
Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Vincent Wade, who's a Professor of Computer Science at Trinity College Dublin. And producer of this show is Conala Moran. Our studio manager is Peter Rice. Engineers Lee Brennan and Luke Delaney. And thank you to South Dublin Podcast Studio.